So, welcome. Good morning to this class on Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. A couple things I want to hit before we actually jump into the meat of anything. We are recording to make it accessible to people who aren't doing in-person church yet. Make it accessible to people in the future. And in case people miss classes, you can catch up easy. Had this question a couple times. You do not need to buy the book. If you want to buy the book and read alongside the class, that's not a bad thing. I'm cutting out a lot of details for the sake of brevity. But if you read alongside, you could probably finish the book significantly faster than the class. So it's something like $10 on Amazon, and if you're really desperate and you don't want to pay $10, the audiobook is free on YouTube. So we were worried about with the recording if that would discourage people from discussion, so we're just going to record me talking, and the discussion at the end will stop the recording. The other thing is questions. If you have questions, feel free to jump in and ask them. I don't mind being interrupted. I'll also try to remember, and I'm bad at this, but I will try to remember to have easy places to jump in to ask questions, to invite questions, because it always bothers me when someone's talking and you have a question and you don't want to interrupt, and they ask for questions about 45 minutes later and it's not appropriate anymore. All right. Or you forget. So, plan for future weeks. We're going to run through this in 12 weeks. And we're going to do about 3 chapters a week, with the exception of this week. It's going to be a little wonky, but we'll talk about that. The first month, in June, we're going to run through the first section of the book. There's 3 sections of the book, and so it works out very nicely. On apologetics. On, is Christianity true? How do we know it to be true? And so you'll probably, a lot of the questions and things we'll talk about, you'll think like, I already know all this, or like why are we asking this? I know the answer to this, but these are good tools to have in your toolbox. This is good in the world that we live in, to be able to structure yourself against the materialist worldview, because that's what our society has by and large. And so when you encounter that online, on the news, to be able to say like, because we all have those little tempters and doubters in your head. And so it's good to have something to throw back against them. In July, we'll move on to Christian behavior is the title of that section. I think it's probably a better title, How Christians Should Behave. and more specifically, it's diving not just into what the Bible tells us to do, but why. Because I think I'm going to be a little bit judgmental here. I think there's a certain kind of shallow Christian who, they'll say, like, God says this, and you say, well, why did God say that? Well, because he's God, and what he says goes, and it's not any deeper than that. It's like, no, you can actually dive into, like, why did God give us the commandments he did? And you can learn a lot of cool things about God's character that way. So we'll jump into that. And then in August, we'll move on to Christian theology, and we'll talk about the Trinity, we'll talk about God's relationship to humans, and so on. Last thing I want to say before we actually jump into the meat of the matter is I had a goal when I was writing up my notes to not read from the book too much, because you can tell when someone's speaking spontaneously versus when they're reading to you from a script. And reading from a script is so boring. So my goal was to not read from the book very often. I did not succeed on that. I was writing up notes, and I pretty quickly realized that a lot of my notes was just copying verbatim from the book. So I apologize for that. I know it's less interesting to listen to, but I think that in a great many of the cases, the man said it best. So with that, I'd like to jump right in. And we're going to start talking about Lewis's life. And I want to start out giving a little bit of context to the book. Why it was written the way it was, what the world was like when it was written. I think that's important to kind of give that background. It will be a nice foundation. I promise we will get to the book this week. We will get to chapter 1. So Lewis was born 2 years before the turn of the 20th century. He was born 2 years before 1900. When he was a young boy, he was like 6, and his mother died of cancer. And his father didn't really know what to do about that, so he sent his boys off to boarding school, which turned out to be fairly abusive. His dad didn't know it was abusive, that's just how it turned out. And so by the time Lewis was a young adult, he was through and through atheist. He was born to a Christian household, but life was full of tragedy, and so he became an atheist. He was an atheist all through World War I, in which he served as an infantryman. Got out on the other side of World War I and was hired to be an Oxford professor. No small feat. Working at Oxford, he met a man named J.R.R. Tolkien, whose claim to fame is writing Lord of the Rings. Among some other gentlemen, Tolkien was a devout Catholic, and Lewis had some other friends working at Oxford who are also various Christians. One of his favorite authors as an atheist was an author named George MacDonald, who was a preacher and Christian author. And so Lewis went through his 20s really fighting against Christianity. Didn't want to be a Christian. He was really dragging his feet. He says that in one of his books, the night that he fell on his knees and admitted to God that God was God, he was the most downtrodden and broken-hearted Christian in England. He begrudgingly became a Christian, but he couldn't think his way out of it. He tried and just kept ending back up at Christianity. So after he became a Christian, he started doing some apologetic works. He wrote Miracles, which had some criticism. He wrote a book called Pilgrim's Regress, and had some success as a Christian author. And then World War II hit. And he was too old to serve, and it was World War II, and life sucked for everyone, and people were very unhappy. And so the British government was looking for any way to lift people up, trying anything to help with people's spirits. So one of the things they tried was they hired Lewis to give a series of radio talks, which he did, and they were a huge success. And so they asked him back again, and then a third time. And those 3 series of radio talks became Mere Christianity. So this book was originally given as radio talks, speeches, during World War II. And I think that is really poignant to dwell on for just a moment, because we're separated from World War II by about 80 years. And for us, yeah. And for us, it's an event in the past. Yeah. It's an event in the past. It has a definite beginning, middle, and end. And for Lewis, during these speeches, and for his friends and family, and for the nation around him, it wasn't an event, it was the state of the world. We like to kind of make Hitler and the Nazis these fantasy villains, like the ultimate villains. Like, we don't have to think about them. They're bad people, they're villains. But it's like, no, for Lewis, these were real people and real political views that, like, here's something weird to think about. 5 years earlier, before these talks were given, Hitler wasn't the epitome monster. He was just another foreign leader. It's really, it's much more live for him. And I bring that up because Lewis mentions the Nazis in the war throughout the book, and I think that's important to... Lewis is looking at not the Nazis as monsters, but as other human beings, because he's going to talk about how people live forever, about how we're made in the image of God. And so, at the same time, thinking about those facts while the Holocaust is going on is a very interesting juxtaposition. Last thing I need to say before we actually jump into chapter 1 is Lewis was intentionally writing this. I'm now going to quote a little bit from the preface, but the preface is kind of sporadic and jumps from place to place, which I do that too, but it makes it harder to follow. he was intentionally non-denominational. He did not want to... Tolkien, as I said, was Roman Catholic. Lewis belonged to the Church of England. He didn't want to present anything in the radio talks or in the book that was specific to any denomination, or even worse, something to him personally, as something all Christians believe. So he tried to guard against this by sending the original script to 4 clergymen. And I'm going to read to you from the book now. He says, I send it to an Anglican, Methodist, a Presbyterian, and a Roman Catholic, asking for the criticism. The Methodist thought I had not said enough about faith, and the Roman Catholic thought I had gone rather too far about the comparative unimportance of theologies and explanations of the atonement. That's a mouthful. We'll talk about that more when we get to it. But 2 things. Methodist had 1 complaint. Roman Catholic had 1 complaint. Otherwise, all 5 of us were agreed. That's no small accomplishment, I think, that he was able to present, and that was his goal, was to present something core or central or, how does he put it, agreed upon Christianity, or mere Christianity. Christianity that's central to all Christians at all times. So, with that, I want to jump into chapter 1. And I'm going to start by reading straight from it. Sorry, it's boring. Everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny, and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant. But however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kinds of things they say. They say things like this. How'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone. He's not doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first, cut in first? Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you've promised. People say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. Now, what's interesting about all those examples, and that sounds like people arguing, what's interesting about all that is that the person saying the things is not just saying, your behavior doesn't please me. They're appealing to some kind of standard of behavior, and this is important, that they expect the other person to know about. And what's equally interesting is that the other person virtually never says, well, I don't care about your standard. What the other person tends to do is try to make out that really they weren't breaking the standard. There's some excuse that lets them off. I'm going to read, Lewis says, he pretends there is some special reason in this particular case why the person who took the seat first should not keep it. Or that things were quite different when he was given the bit of orange. Or that something has turned up which lets him off keeping his promise. It seems that both people have some kind of rule or law about fair play or decent behavior, or whatever you want to call it, that they agree on. If they didn't agree on it, they could fight like animals, but they couldn't quarrel in the human sense, since quarreling, arguing, means trying to show that the other person is in the wrong. Lewis says, there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. Just as there would be no sense in saying that a soccer player had committed a foul unless there was some agreement about the rules of soccer. This rule of right and wrong used to be called the law of nature by the old thinkers, Aristotle, Confucius. More specifically, it was called the law of human nature. Just like organisms are governed by biological laws, and anything with mass is governed by gravitational laws, the old thinkers thought that mankind was governed by human laws, the law of human nature. However, unlike the organic laws or the laws of gravitation, which had to be obeyed, man could choose to obey his law or not. Lewis says, this law was called the law of nature because people thought that everyone knew it by nature and did not need to be taught it. They did not mean, of course, that you might not find an odd individual here or there who did not know it, just as you might find a few people who are colorblind or have no ear for a tune. But taking the race as a whole, they thought that the human idea of decent behavior was obvious to everyone. And I believe they were right. If they were not, then all the things we said about the war were nonsense. What was the sense in saying the enemy was in the wrong unless right was a real thing, which the Nazis at bottom knew as well as we did and ought to have practiced? If they had no notion of what we mean by right, then, though we might still have had to fight them, we could no more have blamed them for that than for the color of their hair. Lewis goes on to talk about what would different moralities, like a really totally different morality, look like. Like imagine a country, well, this idea of a universal morality is not very popular, and it's pushed back a lot. And one of the most common counters to it is the idea that different cultures at different times throughout history have had different moralities, right? No, not really. If you actually go and look at them, like the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, Romans, ancient China, modern America, and modern China, the first thing you will notice is how similar they all are. You could disagree on who you ought to be unselfish to, whether it's just your family or your tribe or your nation or the world at large. Everyone agrees you ought not to be selfish. Cultures have disagreed on whether you could have one wife or four. They all agree a man can't have any woman he wants. The last thing that's on point here is that people who say there's no real right and wrong depend on decency or fair play themselves. Lewis says, whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in a real right and wrong, you will find that same man going back on this a moment later. He may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he will be complaining it's not fair before you can say Jack Robinson. A nation may say treaties don't matter, but then next minute they spoil their case by saying that the particular treaty they want to break was an unfair one. But if treaties do not matter, and there's no such thing as right and wrong, what is the difference between a fair treaty and an unfair one? Have they not let the cat out of the bag and shown that, whatever they say, they really know the law of nature, just like anyone else? It seems we're forced to believe in a real right and wrong. People might be wrong about it sometimes, like you get your math problems wrong, but math isn't a subjective taste or opinion. It's like the multiplication table. And Lewis will use this analogy throughout the book, but it's useful here of, yes, there are people who don't know the multiplication table, but it's not like we could have made it different if we wanted to. So that's Lewis's first point. Here's his second point. No one is keeping this law. He says, I'm not preaching. Lord knows I'm not better than anybody else. He's just drawing attention. He's not trying to make you feel guilty. He just wants to draw attention to a fact. That this year, or this month, or more likely this day, we have all failed to practice the kind of behavior we expect from others. There may be excuses. That time you snapped at the children happened when you were really tired. That bit of shady business you did came when you were really tight on money. And that promise that you made to so-and-so, well, you wouldn't have promised if you knew how busy you were going to be. And if I only knew how irritating your husband or wife or brother or sister could be, I wouldn't wonder at your behavior towards them. Lewis says, I'm just the same. That is to say, I do not succeed in keeping the law of nature very well. And the moment anyone tells me I'm not keeping it, there starts up in my mind a string of excuses as long as your arm. The question at the moment is not whether they are good excuses. The point is that they are one more proof of how deeply, whether we like it or not, we believe in the law of nature. The truth is, we believe in decency so much that we cannot bear to face the fact that we are breaking it. We only make excuses for our bad behavior when we're tired or hungry. That's the reason we have a bad temper. We get the credit for our good temper. These 2 points are the foundation of the next 3 weeks as we're working through apologetics. Humans, number 1, humans at all times and all places have had this idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. And 2, they do not in fact behave that way. Next week, we'll look at some objections and what the consequences of these laws are. But for now, that's all I have to say about that.